Well, welcome. Thank you very much for clicking on this and coming for this quick and hopefully very informative overview of how carbon credit can supercharge your net zero commitments. So it's me, Andy Harris, the Managing Director of Nature Broking, and I'll be doing this in conjunction with Sarah Amethyst. So if you don't know anything about Nature Broking, we are a carbon credit and natural capital intermediary. We work in the premium carbon credit market, and we work with organisations looking to meet their net zero commitments in a way that they can be proud of, but are diversified, de-risked, and even insurable. We work with large organisations who are looking to have real impact, support their supply chains, and promote their products in a better way to their customers using great carbon projects all around the UK and around the world.
Thanks, Andy. So I'm Sarah Joy Newton at Amethyst Connect. I'm an adult and paediatric nurse and also have been a medical sales representative. I'm now predominantly a tender bid writer and specialise in the sustainability parts of tender bid writing and compliance with the NHS. So today, what we're going to look at is we're going to look at the fact that sustainability is now so key in public procurement tendering. If you want to work with the NHS, then you need to have all your sustainability elements in place, and they include environmental and social value considerations. So what we're going to cover today is the legislation, the supplier roadmap from NHS England Evergreen. Andy's going to talk about carbon credits, how to be net zero, and the types and quality of carbon credits. So the first bit of legislation is PPN 006. This was originally published in June 2021 and was updated in February 25. And you need to have a carbon reduction plan. A carbon reduction plan is where you report on scopes 1, 2 and 3 of your greenhouse gas emissions, and it's a subset of scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions at the moment. You need to commit to being net zero by 2050 and have detailed environmental management measures that will be applied in the performance of the contract. Your carbon reduction plan also needs to be published on your website, and this is a requirement for all tenders with NHS now. We also have the NHS England supplier roadmap. I've only put up the forthcoming milestones. We have had several milestones which have already passed now, one of those being to have a carbon reduction plan. From April 2027, which is the next one, all suppliers will be required to publicly report your targets emissions and publish your carbon reduction plan for your global emissions for all of scope 1, 2 and all 15 categories of your scope 3 emissions. There are also milestones for April 28 for product carbon footprinting, and from 2030 where the NHS will no longer work with suppliers who do not publish and report through their net zero journey. Public Procurement Notice 002 in February 25 was the refreshed version of social value in the award of central government contracts, which was originally published in June 2020. And this is where they took consideration for social value and they made it a requirement. And there is a requirement of a minimum of a 10% score. This 10% score of social value in tenders can be the difference between winning or losing a tender bid. The social value model links into the National Procurement Policy Statement, which came into effect in February 25, which outlined the strategic priorities of public procurement. It made clear 5 clear missions: kickstart economic growth, make Britain a clean energy superpower, take back our streets, break down barriers to opportunity, and build a national health service fit for the future. And this was then published into the social value model. And the key ones that we're looking at here are 2 and 5. Make Britain a clean energy superpower, delivering additional environmental benefits in the performance of the contract. And Andy will talk more about how working towards net zero using carbon credits can help you with this part of the social value model. And then the other one it does also link into is build an NHS fit for the future. And an NHS fit for the future is to be net zero by 2045. Some of you may also tender with social value using the social value portal, also known as the TOMS, the themes, outcomes and measures. And the themes, outcomes and measures through the social value portal, they have one called Planet, Safeguarding and Restoring Our World. So the things that we're going to talk about in this webinar will relate to how you can deliver on that part of the TOMS, if that's a way that you are asked to demonstrate your social value in tenders. The other thing that we're going to talk about very briefly is the NHS England Evergreen assessment. And I know Andy's going to talk about it a little bit more later on in this webinar. So the components of the NHS England Evergreen assessment cover net zero, social value and modern slavery. There are 4 maturity levels, and your maturity score will be valid for 12 months to be, and needs to be completed yearly. You can make any significant updates at any time, and your net zero journey is really important in how you then demonstrate through the levels and how you progress through the levels in Evergreen. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Andy now.
Great, thank you so much. So yes, so Sarah touched on a lot of, or alluded to a lot of why carbon crediting and carbon offsets and investing in carbon projects are so important to your Evergreen, your net zero supplier roadmap, and generally supporting your net zero journey. To start off with just very quick jargon buster about what a carbon credit is. I won't go into everything on this screen, but ultimately a carbon credit or a carbon offset, they're the same thing, represent 1 ton of carbon removed or reduced from going into the atmosphere. There's lots of different ways and means of doing it, from tree planting to very technological solutions, but ultimately that's what it always equals. Sorry, next slide, if that's possible. So what do we mean by net zero and why is it important? Well, everybody who has a net zero target is reducing their emissions, and that is really, really important for us to get to a healthier world and ecosystem. Along the way to reducing emissions, you may be investing in carbon credits or carbon offsets to mitigate your current emissions that are going into the atmosphere. And that's represented on here by the beyond value chain mitigation part of this graph, where you see those arrows, which are you offsetting your along the way of your decarbonisation journey. The net zero is the bit in green on the right of that graph. It's once you have reduced down as much as you possibly can, and then you must use carbon offsets in order to get rid of the last little bit that are impossible to get rid of. Those are called your residual emissions, and that is being net zero once you're doing that. So if you've set a net zero year, let's say 2045, you're going to reduce down as much as possible by 2045 and then offset using carbon credits and carbon projects those residual emissions you can't get rid of. So what does that mean? Well, ultimately, it means that every company, in order to reach net zero, will need to use carbon credits. That is an unavoidable fact, and you will need to invest in very high quality, robust carbon projects in order to do so. And this is critically important for all sorts of things, for both your suppliers, but also your customers and your employees and so on. So just showing here a couple of the drivers and the benefits, I suppose, of having a proper robust net zero target and using carbon offsets for that. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that you could talk about in all of these different categories, from just straight having impact and doing a bit for climate change, all the way through to some very noddy accounting things where you can include carbon credits on your balance sheet and improve the value of your business, through to meeting employees, increasing employee satisfaction and making cost savings. The most important thing I think we're going to talk about today is really around that competitive advantage and that regulation piece. So if you are supplying the NHS, you have to meet the NHS supplier, net zero supplier roadmap. You will be beholden to social value regulations and procurement practices, as Sarah touched on. And of course, you have the Evergreen assessment, and that is super important in order for you to get a competitive advantage, but also to meet those regulations. And taking control of your net zero goals properly is critical in that. So you can really boil these down to direct and indirect drivers. Those direct drivers are things like your science-based targets initiative. So if you have a net zero target aligned to that, and also live consultations that are going on from the UK government, which will turn into frameworks around using carbon credits for your net zero targets, which are expected by the end of 2025, but also indirect drivers. So as we touched on, these customer drivers such as the NHS supply roadmaps or wider regulatory drivers if you're in the TCFD framework or CSRD frameworks if you're an organisation driven by those. So there are drivers coming kind of from both sides: internal, external, governmental, non-governmental. It's all there kind of pushing you towards having a robust net zero target and using carbon credits as part of that. So what does it mean in terms of the NHS specifically? Well, you obviously have the Evergreen framework to assess against, which includes social value aspects. And actually give a talk around what does a carbon credit do as part of this? Well, if you're investing in a project, let's say regenerative agriculture in the UK, or planting woodland projects, or peatland restoration, or any number of different activities, you're not only sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, creating carbon credits for your net zero targets, but you're having huge impacts on the local community, biodiversity, nature and wildlife in those areas as well. And what that enables you to do is demonstrate two really important things. One, you're taking control of your net zero targets properly. You understand you must use carbon credits and have them well in advance of your net zero year in order to really be taking your net zero targets seriously. You can demonstrate that to the NHS. And number two, you can demonstrate your social value, and you can demonstrate it locally with projects that are near to you. And those two things are hugely impactful in order to get a more mature score on your Evergreen, look better for your for any kind of procurement that you're going for from a governmental perspective, but also in order to actually meet your net zero targets in a more robust way. So very quickly touching on what does it actually mean tangibly? How do we bring this into focus using carbon credits for your NHS supply and your net zero targets? Well, look, there are loads of different ways to different types of carbon credits you can buy. Some are better than others, some are more robust than others, and different ones are in different locations. You really want to be looking at on this category the removals, which actually suck carbon out the atmosphere. So activities like rewilding or tree planting or direct air capture is a technological based version of that. So the stuff in blue is what you want to be looking at. And what you can do is you can align this to a particular contract you might have. So you don't need to just do this for your net zero journey, although you should be, but you can also say, we sell X to the NHS and we know how much carbon goes into producing that product. And therefore we're going to offset that and put that as part of our contracts. We've just started doing that, for example, with a company that sells computer equipment to the NHS, where they know that each piece of equipment has a certain number of tons of carbon it produces in actually producing that equipment. And so they've offset it as part of that. And they've managed to win the tender with the NHS in order to, by making those products carbon neutral going into the NHS. So there are loads of different cool things you can do, which have loads of different co-benefits that can be there for your residual emissions, but also along the way as you're decarbonising for particular contracts. The final thing we'll touch on is there's many different things that make a good carbon credit. It's not just that they are removals, as we looked on the previous slide. There's all sorts of different things to consider, and it's really important that you grapple with this and understand what you're purchasing and how it works. And it's important to take the right advice when you're going into it. So looking at co-benefits, how permanent is the project? Are there any reputational risks? What kind of standards do they apply to? What are the locations and so on? And this is something that nature breaking can help with, but that you should be looking for in anytime you purchase a carbon credit.
Thanks, Andy. So in conclusion from this webinar, carbon offsetting with good quality carbon credits is an essential part of the net zero journey, but it also supports your compliance with NHS tender requirements. If anything that you've heard today you want to know more about, or you want to ask any questions, then please feel free to reach out to myself or Andy at any time to just find out a bit more about that, and we'd be really happy to talk to you further about it. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.